Welcome to the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. We are going to be discussing the 50th anniversary, and we have special guests here to do that with. From Los Angeles, Michael Barenbaum, Dov Wexman, also from Los Angeles. From Israel, Yigal Kipnis, Robert Friedman from Atlanta, Georgia, and myself right now from San Francisco. Maybe I'm getting old, but to me this 50 years went by too fast. I remember very well I was in Israel for the first time, and I was there when the war broke out. And I immediately went to volunteer, and I got the job of being the guard on the beach in a very exclusive area of Israel. Many of you probably know Herzliya Petuach. So it was a very soft job, but every day I was sweating and finding out what's going on up front with the troops. This was a very bad surprise war for Israel. We lost a lot of soldiers, 2,700, I think is the exact number, who died. So today we remember them. And we have a very good program here with Dov Wexman, professor of Israeli studies at UCLA. And I'll have him start right now. Dov, the camera is yours.
Okay, thank you, and hello everybody. I thought I was not alive during the Yom Kippur War. I was born a year after the war. But as with anybody, I think the war had a profound impact upon Israel, and I want to focus less on the war itself. I think you're going to be hearing more about that later, and really talk a bit about how the war is remembered 50 years later and the impact it's had. And I think in many ways, it really opened up many of the things that we see happening in the Middle East to this day. So to start with, it's interesting to recognize that the war has evoked very different collective memories, very different collective reactions among its protagonists. For Egyptians, the Yom Kippur War is what they call the Ramadan War, the October War, is celebrated to this day. In fact, every year on October the 6th, it's one of their biggest national holidays when the Egyptians celebrate the Egyptian army's successful crossing of the Suez Canal. And this despite the fact that later the Egyptian army was thoroughly defeated by the IDF in the war. In contrast to this, Israelis look back with a great deal of sadness, some anger, and really mourn the war, seeing it in many ways not as a military triumph, but rather as a tragedy. And there's good reason for why Israelis take this view. They suffered a massive shock in the outbreak of the war on the holiest day of the year for Jews, and the fact that about 2,700 Israeli soldiers were killed in that war and almost 9,000 wounded. Those figures might not seem so great to many Americans. So it's, I think, helpful to put those figures in perspective. As a proportion of Israel's population, the number of Israeli soldiers killed in the war was twice as many as a proportion as Americans killed in the roughly 15-year-long war in Vietnam. So that can, I think, give you some sense of the massive cost that this war had upon Israel, and why Israel's victory in the war really felt more like defeat for Israelis. Unlike the 1967 war, Israel's victory in that war, which was greeted with jubilation and a sense of triumphalism and even euphoria, in the aftermath of the 1973 Yom Kippur War, there was no jubilation, there was no triumphalism. Instead, there was recriminations, there was blame for why the war took place, why Israelis were surprised, why the IDF wasn't sufficiently prepared. And that ultimately had a massive political impact because it really undermined public confidence in the Israeli Labour Party, which had governed Israel really without interruption under different names since Israel's founding in 1948, and ultimately, therefore, led to the electoral upheaval, the big shock of Menachem Begin's Likud party's victory in the 1977 elections. So in that respect, the Yom Kippur War had a long-term impact upon Israel in undermining the power of the Labour Party and in propelling the Likud into government. But I think even more profoundly than that, the war transformed Arab-Israeli relations. And in many ways, the shifting relationship between Israel and the Arab world today, and the conversations and speculation that's taking place about the possibility of some kind of a normalization agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia, all of these, I think, can be traced back to the aftermath and the impact of the Yom Kippur War, in particular because the war really convinced Israelis of the need to make peace with Egypt and encourage their willingness to ultimately return the whole of the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in exchange for a peace agreement. So if it hadn't been for the Yom Kippur War, I think it's safe to say that the Camp David Accords, which later came about, would never have occurred, and the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, which was signed in 1979, would not have occurred. And that peace treaty really had a profound impact upon the broader Arab-Israeli conflict. It essentially meant that the Arab states no longer had a credible war option against Israel without Egypt as part of that Arab military coalition. And so it really stabilized the Arab-Israeli conflict. Even the border between Israel and Syria, although Syria never signed and still hasn't signed a peace agreement with Israel, the fact is that that border has been relatively stable, relatively quiet since the end of the Yom Kippur War. So in many ways, the stabilization of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the beginning of a diplomatic rapprochement between Israel and the Arab world can be traced back to that conflict, as can Saudi Arabia's growing role in the Middle East and in the Arab-Israeli conflict and in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in particular, because of course Saudi Arabia and other Arab members of OPEC famously used the oil embargo to punish the United States and other Western countries for its support for Israel. That sent global oil prices skyrocketing and really elevated the importance of Saudi Arabia in the conflict and in the Middle East in general. And so in terms of regional affairs, we can see that the Yom Kippur War had very, very lasting influence. And finally, in terms of America's role in the region, the outcome of the war led to Egypt's realignment, Egypt defecting from the Soviet camp, allying itself with the United States to help bring about the return of the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. And Egypt's defection from the Soviet camp really signaled the beginning of the end of Soviet influence in the region and the ascendancy and the sole power of the United States as the kind of regional hegemon. So in many ways, the Middle East for the next 3 decades was shaped, was influenced by this war. So when we look back on this war from today, from the perspective of 50 years, it's important first and foremost to think of those who lost their lives, those who were seriously injured and traumatized by the war, and the impact it's had on their families and their friends to this very day. And it's also important to think about the war's impact upon Israel and the Middle East as a whole. And in that respect, the war ultimately helped pave the way for hopeful peace between Israel and the Arab world.
As you know, JLTV needs to make some money, so we're going to a commercial. Please come back afterwards.
Dov, I want to ask you, first of all, thank you for an interesting presentation. I want to ask you uh, a twofold question. In one sense, we're still fighting the Six-Day War, which was Israel's great victory. And supposedly Israel's great victory. We, at least it appeared, but the outcome is unclear. You said something very interesting, which is that Saudi Arabia, and with the Abraham Accords and perhaps Saudi Arabia joining in, is actually a transformative moment that can be attributed to the Yom Kippur War. And by that I mean that in a very real sense, if this happens, then Saudi Arabia has changed in a very basic way. It's changed from the idea that its power was going to be in the sale of the sale of resources, namely oil. It's changed into the idea that its power has to be found in a knowledge-based economy and a knowledge-based war, and that in that Israel is a potential ally rather than an adversary. And if that happens, then essentially the incomplete victory of Israel, and remember, part of what allowed the peace process to take place was that Kissinger put a stop to Israel's quarantine over the Egyptian Third Army. So if that were to occur, then what we have is the idea that incomplete victory rather than complete victory ended up, ironically, over the long term, helping Israel enormously.
That's right. I think, I would put it somewhat differently. I think paradoxically, Israel's stunning victory in the Six-Day War of 1967 resulted in, a long-term series of problems for Israel, what it's still dealing with to this very day, chiefly the question of the future of the occupied territories. Whereas the Yom Kippur War, on the other hand, which had a kind of an opposite effect upon Israel, and ultimately, as I said, helped Israel to make peace with Egypt, and really changed Israel's long-term, the trajectory of Israel's relationship with the Arab world as a whole. In terms of Saudi Arabia, though, I would just say that one of the interesting consequences, I think, of the war in elevating Saudi Arabia's role in the Arab-Israeli conflict and in the region at large was positioning Saudi Arabia as the kind of protector of Palestinians in some senses, as leading or as championing the Palestinian cause. And it did so in 1973, of course, in part through the use of the oil embargo. But we see today, that one of the obstacles to an agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia is precisely Saudi Arabia's commitment, although it's waned over the years, but still has at least a rhetorical commitment to supporting the Palestinian cause.
Talk for a moment also about the way in which this played out in American-Soviet relations. Because the consequences there, the stakes there were very high, and the consequences quite serious.
Absolutely. So I'm sure when Yigal talks, he'll talk a bit more about the role of the superpowers, the Soviet Union and the US, in the war itself, and really, how the war ultimately put the entire world on the edge of a nuclear confrontation between the superpowers, as the Soviets threatened to intervene to kind of save the Egyptian army, and in response, the US put its own nuclear forces on standby. So one of the things that the war really demonstrated was the global repercussions of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The fact that this wasn't just a local conflict between Israel and the Arab states, but that it could have, global economic repercussions in terms of the rise in oil prices, and security repercussions in terms of the superpower conflict. And that, I think, encouraged both superpowers to work together to bring their respective allies, the Egyptians and the Israelis, to the negotiating table. One of the consequences of that was the important United Nations sponsored Geneva Conference in December of 1973, which was the first time since 1949 where Israel and Arab states, specifically Egypt and Jordan, sat down and had direct face-to-face talks. And that was in part as a result of superpower pressure. So the war actually really encouraged both the superpowers to try to broker a resolution to this conflict rather than just continue to arm their respective allies to the tilt.
I hate to break this up, but we'll return after our commercial. I'd like to get Yigal in on this. Yigal is a historian, a captain on the Israeli Air Force, a helicopter pilot, and he was fought in the Yom Kippur War. Yigal, let's hear your perspective. Manishma.
Thank you very much. Good evening from here, nearby Jerusalem, and good morning for you. I am a little bit older than Dov, so that time, 50 years ago, I was a reserve pilot. But I don't want to talk as a reserve pilot. I don't want to talk as someone who was there. I would like to talk as a researcher. And as a researcher that I began my studies only, let's say, 35, 40 years later, because until that time, it is not historical research. So we talk about 31, the road to war. Mainly I talk about the road to war, not the war itself. And the war, which was a culmination of the failure of political analysis. This is Kissinger's definition, and let us understand what he meant. And I would like to emphasize two questions. I think this is the main question. Was the war inevitable, or if you want, could the war have been prevented? This is very, very important question, I think. And the second one, what caused Israel not to probably prepared for the war? Or if you want to be more precisely, what was the political dictate that prevented the IDF from preparing probably for the Egyptian and Syrian attack? The events of October 73 inevitably led to investigations and preoccupation with the question, how did this happen to us, to Israel? The story, as we know, focused on the military aspect for many years, in accord with the question. This determined the answers and dictate public discourse. That was natural. That is where the war experiences were felt. That is where the stories came from. We were there. The dramas, the tragedies, the pictures are there. Dealing with fighting is important for battle heritage, for memorialization, for nostalgia, even for therapy, but not for history. The explanation that developed based on the military aspect, it was a failure of intelligence. The failure of intelligence, as we know, during the days that preceded the war, is not in doubt. So it was being convenient to present this as an explanation for Israeli conduct in the days and the hours leading up to the war. But the interpretation lacks a strong factual basis. Historical research can only be conducted many years after the events. Documentation uncovered in the archives of both Israel and the United States, and very, very important, the integration of the information between them, show us the central role of the political conduct on the way to war. This makes it possible to reveal the secret channel of talks that took place between Henry Kissinger, Golda Meir, and President Sadat, and the missed opportunity for peace negotiation before the war. It reduces and almost eliminates the role of the intelligence failure in decision making. It does not negate, but minimizes the role of the military command in the chaos of the beginning of the war. Because war is more than just fighting. In order to conduct historical research, at least two additional aspects must be investigated about that period. The first one is the social cultural aspects, and the other one is the political aspect. We can say we know that the leaders of Israel and Egypt aspire to peace, no doubt about it, both of them. But Sadat, whose goals were to join forces with the United States and in the framework of peace to return Sinai to Egyptian sovereignty, achieved this goal, while Israel erred in the illusion that it could obtain considerable territory as well as achieving peace, as Kissinger assessed to Israel's failure. And after the war, Kissinger remarked to Meir, "I don't want to blame anyone, but during 73, the war could have been avoided."
Please come back soon after our commercial. Glad to have you back. We are speaking about the Yom Kippur War 50 years later.
Let me ask a couple of questions. Yigal, you are treating the war, as it were, as if it was merely an Israeli-Egyptian situation. There were global powers deeply involved in it. The United States went to the highest level of military readiness. It looked for a period of time that the Soviet Union was going to intervene. And also we had a moment at which the Arabs employed something that became defining of the 1970s generally and also of the 80s, which is they employed the oil weapon and raising the price of oil and amassing what seemed to be the power that comes with the power of the purse. The question is, do you want to put this in a little bit of a larger context?
Yeah, very shortly, but it is very, very important. You are right. We think from our point of view that the game is between Arab and between our Israel and Egypt, or Egypt and Syria. We forgot that the situation, the political situation, give the limited of our activity. And as you know, it's a period of two superpower, and Kissinger and Nixon try to push the Soviet Union for the Middle East. This is why they wait until Anwar Sadat, the Egyptian, will come directly to them, not through the Soviet Union, because they don't want the Soviet Union to be in the game. And this is a turning point that we can see in the beginning of 73. Anwar Sadat, after he stabilized the situation in Egypt, he threw out all the pro-Soviet from Cairo, and he created a secret channel through the CIA to the White House, not to the State Department. He understood who is the strong power in Washington. And for Kissinger, even it was a personal reason, because it came to him, not to Rogers, the secretary. So in such a situation, the Israeli has to understand that it was a change, really a change in the political situation in the beginning of 73. and we did not understand it.
Here we are 50 years later, and we talk about the fact that the war was not only between Egypt and Syria and Israel, but between the two powers, Soviet Union and America, and the Soviets always want to flex their muscles. Today, people think that the war against Ukraine, from Putin's standpoint of view, is only because of Ukraine. It's not totally true, because Putin thinks that if he wins the war in Ukraine, he shows to the West that he can beat the West as well. So this is why it's very important for America to realize the power of, even today, of the Soviet Union or the former Soviet Union in controlling events. We talk about the Soviets no longer being in the Arab countries. That's not true. Right now they're in Syria, and they have way of getting closer to getting what they want. My father used to say, coming from Hungary, that the Soviet approach is to make fires everywhere and keep the West busy putting out those fires. And that theory works today as well, not only during the Yom Kippur War. It's commercial time again. Don't forget to return. Glad to have you back. We're speaking about the Yom Kippur War 50 years later. Robbie Friedman, what do you think? You also were born in the Eastern Europe like I was, and you have a perspective on this too.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Let me speak. I'm not a Middle Eastern expert or a political scientist. Maybe I'll just offer a personal perspective. So, in 1967, I was in service, and I can tell you that in the IDF, and I can tell you that the IDF at that time was preparing for 250,000 dead because of the war, and temporary cemeteries were dedicated basically anywhere that they could find, some green pastures to bury the dead. There were units of soldiers, rabbis, and physicians, 3 in a unit, that were tasked with the horrible duty of informing up to 20 families of lost fallen soldiers. Just to give you a sense, this was almost 10% of the population. At the time, it was just about 3 million. So
That's
250,000. Right. Yeah, 250,000, that was a massive number. Well, we now know that after 6 days, the number of casualties was 779. And very few people at the time knew about the expected numbers, and I was one of them. And I remember I was sort of jumping out of joy that, it's only 779. And soldiers around me said, "Are you crazy? 779 people were lost." And I said, "Yes, but just imagine that it would have been 250,000. So I had those numbers juggling in my mind. Now, let's jumpstart quickly to the 73 war. So I arrived in the United States on August 20th, 1973, and started graduate school at the University of Minnesota at the time. And I remember Saturday, October 5th, as if it happened now, not yesterday, but now. In the Midwest, the TV news, the nightly news, the evening news begins at 5:30, not at 6:30 as in the East Coast. And some of you may recall that the week prior to the war, there were 13 Syrian MiGs shot down above the Golan Heights. And that was not the first time that happened. And I said, something is brewing up there. Well, at 5:30, the news started and the broadcaster said, "War, war, war." And you had this sort of picture of an explosion. The technology then wasn't that great. And my wife said, there's war going on there. And I said, well, maybe it's just skirmishes in the area. Well, we went out to a reception for the new graduate students. At 10 o'clock, the hosting professor said, let's open the TV to watch the news before the Israelis finish the war, because the world got used to finishing a war in 6 days. Well, we know how it happened. It lasted three weeks and was
19 days.
unexpected. Okay, who counts? 19, 21? Okay, 3 weeks. And the results were horrible. But as was mentioned by the speakers before, the 1967 outcome gave Israel a sense of invincibility.
That's
Israelis
right.
said, and this was the conception that Gilad was talking about in 1973, that the Arabs will be stupid to start a war because they're going to lose, and if they'll start it, they're going to be smashed, which obviously didn't happen. From a military perspective, the victory in 1973 was even bigger than the one in 67, because Israel had the surprise factor in 67, and the Air Force did an outstanding job and basically finished the war in the first 3 hours, and the rest was up to infantry. In 73, that was not the case. There was a cynical joke that was actually fairly close to reality, that the Egyptians are going to meet the Syrians in Tel Aviv. That Israel at that time was probably 10 minutes away from decimation, had the Air Force not bring reinforcement up in the Golan Heights, and the unit of Kahalani overcame the Syrian onslaught. I lost 2 of my friends, Doron and Eitan, in Division 7 of the Armored Corps on the Golan Heights, and then it's the aftermath of the war. And I started graduate school, as I mentioned, and suddenly I felt 2 things. A, that initially it was a loss. After that, yes, it was a victory, but at a terrible cost. But instead of the world looking at Israel as a victim that was attacked, that was the oil crisis that began, and suddenly people said, oh, we're waiting in line at the gas stations because Israel started a war or couldn't win a war. And suddenly the fair-haired child of Israel that overcame the terrible odds in 1967 was no more. And now I think that we can pinpoint the attacks against Israel, the rise of anti-Semitism, the BDS, to the outcome of the 1973 war. I've no question in my mind that is a pivotal change. Yes, after that, Sadat came to the Knesset, and yes, after that we had a peace accord with Egypt, followed by a peace accord with Jordan, and then we have the accords with the Emirates, and now the discussion of a possible accord, with Saudi Arabia. In terms of, my personal take, I think that if you look at Steve tried to get the discussion to a macro level of superpower involvement, and I think he's right. I want to take it to a geopolitical level. And if you look at that part of the world for 3,000 years, it was a center of war and conflict like no other place in the world. there's no place that had more wars, more dead, in more battles than the Middle East. And even now, in the age of transportation, aviation, electronic achievements, that piece of land that connects three continents and by extension the rest of the world is still very important. It's still an issue of control. And now the one that wants to control it individually, independently, and with its proxies in Gaza and in Lebanon and in Syria is Iran. Iran is now aiming at becoming the superpower controlling the Middle East. Turkey, by the way, is not far behind. And we're now mentioning the war of the past. I am afraid that it's not the last one. And I think that Iran is clearly the biggest threat. Turkey remains to be seen. I know it's a part of NATO, but I have some worries about Turkey as well. So I'll stop at that.
Our last commercial. Please come back to finish our program. Welcome back to our show. We are talking about the Yom Kippur War 50 years ago. We only have a few minutes left. I'd like Michael Barenbaum to make a concluding statement about not only the Yom Kippur War, but our future as Israelis.
Well, I'd like to say a couple of things. I think that I was in Israel in '67. Ironically, I was in Israel as a volunteer. And when I arrived in Israel, I had a very interesting dilemma, which is I came back to Jerusalem, and the question is, where could I go to sleep? I couldn't get a hotel room because the hotels were reserved for potential hospitals and also for soldiers that needed to rest. And I couldn't stop at anybody's home because to knock on the door was the great fear that somebody was coming to tell you that your son had been killed in battle. So I ended up having to go to a woman friend of mine who was not a girlfriend and say, "Welcome, I'm now your guest." I think that we have a danger in the the aftermath of the 6-Day War. The great danger was the danger of overconfidence, which said we can take on the entire world. The danger of Yom Kippur, and this is one of the things that became as a shock to the Israeli psyche, is that all of a sudden Israel found itself for a period of time dependent on the goodwill of the United States in order to survive. It was dependent upon a president who was both an anti-Semite and supported Israel because he was anti-Soviet, on a Secretary of Defense who had converted from Judaism to Lutheranism while in college at Harvard, and on a Secretary of State who described himself in those days as of Jewish origin. That wasn't the way in which Zionism was going to imagine itself. Zionism imagined itself as the Jews being independent, and found itself in a deeply complex, interdependent world. And I want to stress that because I think one of the consequences of Yom Kippur was we found how interdependent the world was. The Israel conflict with Egypt and Syria, and notice Jordan stayed out of the Yom Kippur War, all of a sudden became a geopolitical conflict with the Soviet Union and the United States using proxies, even though by that time Sadat had gotten rid of Soviet advisors. It also became a proxy war for the Arabs beginning to assert their control of natural resources in a world that was addicted to oil. And in one sense, oil became a dramatic centerpiece of it all. I think and you were correct in the way in which it impacted on the United States. It impacted on the United States in '73 with a quadrupling almost immediately of the price of oil. And then again in '79 with the Iranian crisis when we saw signs burn Jews, not oil, and all of that. So we have to beware of overconfidence. We have to beware of isolation. We have to be deeply aware of the interdependence and the multivalence of that interdependence in a geopolitical world. And I fear that the illusion that one can operate only independently is an illusion that we have today in certain segments of the Israeli population. The other thing I'd like to point out is for the Jews, the Yom Kippur War, which we call the Yom Kippur War, in the Arab world, it came at the end of Ramadan. And I'm not sure that the Egyptians were aware that it was the end of, that it was on Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, ironically, provided Israel with an advantage and a tremendous disadvantage. Disadvantage is that Israel had few troops at the beginning of the war because it was on a minimal scale, just necessary, what was thought necessary for the holiday, for the holy day. The advantage, ironically, was that Israel was able to mobilize quickly because they knew where all the soldiers were. There were no traffic on the road, and if an army functions on logistics, then those logistics were a tremendous advantage. The other element is that Israel found itself deeply hampered by not being able to operate with a preemptive strike, and militarily that became a tremendous danger. Politically, ironically, it became a significant advantage in mobilizing American support. And consequently, we found ourselves in a very complex world at a very dangerous time. And I thought that the last presentation shows how complex the world is today, and also the nature of the dangers that we have at this point in time. Let me thank everybody for their presentations. It was interesting and informative. And let me wish everybody as we begin this new year in celebration, as we've gotten through the high holy days, let's hope that the year 5784 is a significantly better one than 5783.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Yigal. Thank you, Dov. Thank you, Robbie. Thank you for being at our program today. This is only one of our programs. We have many more, and we do a lot to Holocaust Remembrance programs. Please support us. Come on to menschfoundation.org, and please be generous.